when a mysterious letter arrives for a woman already buried beneath the magnolia trees, an old secret begins to stir in the heart of Magnolia Court. Welcome, dear listener. You're in just the right place for a tale of quiet gardens, whispered truths, and the ever-observant Miss Marple, who is never far when the past refuses to stay silent. Where are you joining us from today? What time is it for you now? How has your day been so far? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you, and it helps others discover these mysteries too. Now, find something warm to sip, get comfortable, and let's begin. There was something deeply unchanging about Magnolia Court, a quiet dignity that even the steady encroachment of ivy and the faded patina of its window panes could not dispel. Miss Marple, having accepted the kind invitation of Mrs. Prudence Hartley for a short visit, arrived just as the spring sunshine began to coax the first magnolia buds into tentative bloom. The garden, though less fastidiously tended than in its heyday, still held the charm of structure and memory. A weathered sundial stood sentinel near the edge of the path, its inscription long dulled by time. Prudence greeted her with warmth and a pot of tea already steeping in the drawing-room. Their conversation wandered, as it often did, from rheumatism to the quality of eggs, and then, gently, to Eleanor Drake. "She rarely leaves her rooms now," Prudence murmured, pouring the tea with a tremor in her wrist. "Still insists on taking her breakfast alone." Miss Marple said nothing but glanced, almost instinctively, at the closed upper window overlooking the west lawn. There was a stillness about the house, not merely the quiet of genteel age, but a silence more deliberate, as if something lay suspended in the air, waiting. In such places, she knew, time did not move so much as settle, and where time settled, secrets often followed. She stirred her tea gently, watching the leaf at the bottom of the cup. Magnolia Court, she thought, had the look of a house where too little was said aloud, and far too much remembered. It was on the second morning of Miss Marple's stay that the news came in its subdued fashion, as things often did in villages like Muchwood on Time. Eleanor Drake had passed away in the early hours, having slipped into a quiet sleep from which she had not awoken. The maid who brought the tea tray found her, peaceful and composed, as though she had been waiting for precisely that moment. The village reacted with the appropriate mixture of hushed condolences and mild surprise. She had, after all, lived past 80, and had long ceased to be part of the social rounds. Her name, when mentioned, carried a faint echo of something once whispered, though none would now admit to knowing what that something had been. Miss Marple listened politely, as Mrs. Hartley recalled a time when Eleanor had played violin at charity recitals and hosted garden teas. "A delicate soul," Prudence said with a sigh. Not made for the world, really. But Miss Marple, who had seen the world in its quietest cruelties, noted the choice of words. Not taken from the world, not lost to it, but not made for it. She had heard such phrasing before, often where sadness lingered longer than grief. 3 days after the funeral, modest, tastefully arranged and attended by those whose connections to Eleanor were more social than familial, a letter arrived. It bore no stamp, no return address, and had been delivered by hand to the front hall in the early evening. Mrs. Hartley, having opened it in the presence of Miss Marple, paled and passed it silently across. The envelope was old-fashioned, cream-colored and faintly scented. Within it was a single-folded page, and pressed gently between the paper's creases, a withered magnolia blossom, its once bright petals now tinged brown at the edges. The message, handwritten in a looping, unfamiliar script, read simply, "The truth must be told before the garden blooms again." There was no signature, no clue as to the sender's intent. Only that strange declaration, and the unmistakable presence of the magnolia, a flower both delicate and stubborn, known for blooming when winter had not fully relinquished its grip. Mrs. Hartley, visibly unsettled, said it must be some morbid joke. Miss Marple said nothing, but she noted how the letter had not been sealed, nor, for that matter, had it been creased from long travel. It was too deliberate, too carefully composed, and perhaps most telling of all, it had arrived only once Eleanor Drake was beyond reading it. In the days following the letter's arrival, a subtle shift seemed to occur within the household. Though Eleanor's passing had caused no upheaval, the presence of that singular message appeared to unsettle something far deeper than grief. Whispers between staff were cut short when Miss Marple passed a corridor. The cook, usually firm in her movements, dropped a tray of teacups with a start when Mrs. Hartley mentioned Eleanor's name. It was Caroline Drake, Eleanor's niece and longtime companion, who drew Miss Marple's quietest attention. A woman of precise manner and restrained tone, Caroline had always managed the affairs of Magnolia Court with competent hands. But now her composure seemed brittle, as though balanced precariously atop something unsaid. Her voice in conversation wavered ever so slightly. Her eyes, once quick and steady, darted too often to the drawing-room mantel, where Eleanor's framed photograph had recently been placed. Miss Marple, though careful not to intrude, observed with the seasoned intuition of one who understood that grief was seldom simple. There was something in Caroline's stillness that did not resemble mourning. It resembled waiting, and the house, ever observant in its old bones, seemed to wait with her. The magnolias had begun to flower. Miss Marple stood quietly near the sundial one afternoon, her gloved fingers brushing a petal that had fallen, perfect and pale, upon the grass. She gazed at the stately facade of Magnolia Court, and then back at the single word carved in Latin beneath the sundial's face. Veritas. Truth. She held the letter once more in her hand, the crushed blossom now dried and fragile. There were things here, she thought, that had not seen light for decades, and something, or someone, had decided that the time for silence had passed, just as the garden began to bloom again. The morning of the will reading arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that settles not only in hallways but in people. Miss Marple, having intended her visit to be a brief one, had accepted Mrs. Hartley's quiet suggestion that she remain a day or two longer. "One does so dislike the appearance of haste at such a time," Mrs. Hartley had remarked, and Miss Marple, who never claimed to be hasty but was rarely idle, agreed with a smile. Eleanor Drake's passing had not shocked the household. It had unsettled it, and the letter, now locked in Mrs. Hartley's bureau drawer, hovered unspoken over every exchange like an invisible guest. Preparations for the reading of the will were set for Sunday after church. Mr. Nigel Crowe, the family solicitor, was due to arrive at 11 sharp. He had a reputation for punctuality and a manner that could chill tea. The staff had been directed to keep the drawing-room in order, the armchairs fluffed, the tea service polished, and the grandfather clock wound precisely. Miss Marple took her breakfast alone that morning and watched from the window as the various figures of Magnolia Court moved about the grounds with gestures too precise to be unconscious. There was a stiffness in the air, like an old garment pulled too tightly. She made mental note of Caroline's clipped responses, the way the housekeeper's eyes lingered at the foot of the stairs, and how Lucy Fenley, the younger guest, walked the garden with hands clenched behind her back, as though carrying something she dared not drop. It would be, Miss Marple observed, a very long Sunday, for more than one soul. The drawing-room held the assembled company in a delicate arrangement of civility, each figure placed just so, like an ancestral portrait, hung slightly off-center, dignified, but always suggesting something not quite aligned. Mr. Oswald Fenley was the first to speak, remarking in genial tones that he had not seen Magnolia Court since before the war. His daughter, Lucy, remained close to him, her eyes cast downward, her voice barely audible when introduced. There was about her a quietness that extended beyond shyness. It was not the silence of reserve, but that of vigilance. One felt she was watching everything without ever raising her head. Caroline Drake, for her part, received the solicitor's nod with cool efficiency, taking her seat nearest the fireplace and adjusting her gloves with fingers that moved a little too precisely. Her eyes, when they fell upon Lucy, did not soften. Miss Marple watched them all, outwardly serene but inwardly alert. Mr. Crowe, the solicitor, appeared just as she remembered, tall, correct, and lacking in humor. His black briefcase might well have contained deeds or a loaded pistol. His expression would not have changed. Polite condolences were offered and murmured replies returned. But conversation stumbled awkwardly from topic to topic. Even Mrs. Hartley, usually so adept at smoothing over gaps in conversation, found herself pausing between sentences, uncertain whether to speak or not. Eleanor Drake's portrait hung above the mantel. In life she had rarely smiled, and in oil she looked as though she disapproved of everything beneath her. Miss Marple noted the direction of the eyes. They did not look toward the fireplace, nor the French windows, but toward the sundial beyond the hedges. A curious thing, thought Miss Marple, where a painted gaze chooses to rest. In old houses such as Magnolia Court, it is rarely the footsteps that reveal the truth, but the silences that follow them. And there were many such silences in the hours preceding the reading of the will, some heavy, some brittle, and some almost deliberate. Miss Marple, moving unobtrusively from drawing-room to library, and from parlor to garden path, listened as much with her eyes as with her ears. Mr. Fenley, despite his affable air, had too quickly dismissed Lucy when she quietly inquired about returning to London. There was, in his tone, a veiled impatience that suggested control rather than concern. Edith Clamwell, the housekeeper, avoided Miss Marple with studied effort. Her eyes bore the hard shine of someone who had seen much and said little, but not from discretion. No, Miss Marple thought. Edith had the look of someone who had once spoken too soon and had been reminded not to do so again. As for Mr. Crowe, he appeared absorbed in the details of legal procedure, yet showed visible discomfort when reminded that Eleanor had once spoken of altering her will. He brushed it off with a wave that was far too hasty for a man of his composure. It was, however, the maid, young Elsie, who, in a flurry of nervous curtsies, provided the most curious remark of the morning. "I heard crying, ma'am," she whispered to Miss Marple, wide-eyed and pale. "Coming from the mistress's room. But that was the morning after she died." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind, already attuned to such anomalies, did not forget. It was a peculiar talent of Miss Marple's that she could gather more insight over a shared tea-cake than some inspectors managed in a fortnight. So it was with particular interest that she accepted an invitation to tea with Mrs. Tillinghurst, the vicar's wife, a woman as loyal to the Book of Common Prayer as she was to the village grapevine. With the air of one dispensing historical footnotes rather than scandal, Mrs. Tillinghurst recalled that Magnolia Court had once been quite the center of social life, long before Eleanor withdrew from view. "She was engaged, you know," she confided, lowering her voice more for rhythm than necessity, "to a Captain Lawrence Trent. War years. Terrible business, that. He died. Well, no one quite knew how. They found him near the riverbank. Awful bruise on his temple, but they called it an accident. Some said otherwise. Miss Marple offered the soft sound of concern and let her hostess continue. There was talk, Mrs. Tillinghurst went on delicately, that Eleanor was not the only woman close to the captain. A housemaid at the time. Edith something. Yes, Edith Clamwell. She's the housekeeper now, isn't she? Extraordinary. How time tidies things up. The teacups clinked and the subject turned to parish matters. But the name lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a phrase of music she could not quite place. Old scandals did not disappear, she thought. They sank, like seeds in soil, only to grow again, often in the very gardens meant to hide them. And Magnolia Court had always been famous for its blooms. That evening brought with it a dampness in the air, a heaviness not of weather but of something older, long-held sorrow perhaps, or unspoken dread. The household was subdued. Even Mr. Fenley, whose jovial tone had begun to feel increasingly performative, retired early, claiming fatigue. Miss Marple, however, remained in the small sitting-room with her needlework, her ears attuned not to gossip, but to its absence. When Elsie, the youngest of the maids, passed through with a tea-tray, far later than custom dictated, her face was pale and her hand slightly unsteady. Miss Marple, with the kindest of nods, invited her to rest a moment. It was not her words, but her silence, that drew the girl in. Finally, with a glance toward the stairwell, Elsie whispered something so soft Miss Marple had to lean forward to hear it. "I heard crying, miss," she said. "Real crying, not loud. The sort you don't want no one to hear. Coming from Miss Drake's room." Miss Marple blinked slowly, keeping her tone gentle. "And when was this, my dear?" Elsie swallowed hard. "After she passed, the morning after. I went in with the tea and found her. Peaceful, you know. Cold. But when I passed the door again, I heard it, plain as anything, sobbing." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely thanked the girl and assured her she had done nothing wrong in speaking of it. But her thoughts were sharper than ever. There were many reasons a house might echo with weeping. Grief, regret, or guilt. But to hear it from a room that should have known only silence, after its occupant had already gone, suggested something else. Not just sorrow, not just fear. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, it was a cry from the living, but not from the innocent. The appointed hour approached with the weight of anticipation, muffled by old rugs and older manners. The drawing-room, where time itself seemed to tread lightly, now held within it the full cast of Magnolia Court's recent drama, each participant seated with the precision of a carefully staged tableau. Mr. Crow stood by the sideboard, tall and correct, his hand resting on a slim leather folio. It was not the first will he had read, nor would it be the last, but something in his stance suggested a man mildly bracing for unpleasant weather. Caroline Drake, seated nearest the hearth, maintained an expression of austere patience, her hands folded in her lap, though one finger tapped almost imperceptibly against her palm. Lucy Fenley sat quietly by the window, her eyes not quite meeting anyone's gaze. Mr. Fenley, for all his earlier bonhomie, had adopted a posture of slight detachment, as though watching a minor play whose outcome was of theoretical interest. The staff, positioned discreetly at the back, included Mrs. Hartley, Edith Clamwell, and the younger maid, Elsie. All wore expressions suited to the moment, respectful, muted, but inwardly alert. Miss Marple, placed slightly apart in a high-backed chair, did not speak. She merely observed. She had attended enough such gatherings to know that it was rarely the words of a will that startled most. It was the silence that followed them. And when Mr. Crow finally opened the folio and cleared his throat, She felt the air shift ever so slightly. It was the sound of the past stepping forward. The formal preamble of the will was delivered in the expected tones, legal, restrained, and matter-of-fact. There were small bequests for servants, acknowledgments of debts settled long ago, and a few nods to charitable institutions, all quite proper. Then came the estate. Magnolia Court, as anticipated, was bequeathed in full to Caroline Drake. There was a murmur of polite assent. Nothing unexpected there. But it was the following clause that pulled at the thread of the room's composure. A significant portion of Eleanor Drake's personal holdings, including a selection of valuable jewelry and a considerable trust, was left to Lucy Fenley. There was a beat, barely more than a moment, but in that breath several things occurred. Mr. Fenley's eyes widened fractionally before narrowing. Caroline's hand ceased its discreet tapping. Lucy, pale already, seemed to blanch further, as if the words had arrived in a language she could not yet understand. Mr. Crow read on, unwavering, though Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in his brow. He too, perhaps, had expected a different distribution. When the reading concluded, a silence hung in the room like steam on cold glass. The civility remained, but its foundation had cracked. Politeness resumed quickly, too quickly. Mr. Fenley stood to comment on Eleanor's surprising generosity. Caroline rose to offer tea. Lucy thanked Mr. Crow in a whisper. But beneath the veneer, Miss Marple saw it clearly. Eleanor had unsettled the order of things, not from malice, but from something far older and far deeper. Truth, Miss Marple knew, often arrived dressed as generosity, and rarely was it welcomed. The drawing-room, once stiff with anticipation, now shimmered faintly with discomfort. Polite, of course, but unmistakable. Caroline's expression, though perfectly composed, had developed the faint brittleness of porcelain kept too close to the fire. Her inquiries after tea were mechanical, her compliments to Mr. Crow rehearsed. Only Miss Marple, watching with careful neutrality, noticed the way her mouth tightened whenever Lucy's name arose. Lucy herself sat as though trying to disappear into her chair. She had thanked no one for the inheritance and looked, if anything, deeply troubled by it. Her hands remained in her lap, fingers twisted together. When addressed directly by her father, she answered without raising her eyes. Mr. Fenley attempted joviality, but the ease with which he congratulated his daughter was marred by something overly emphatic in his tone. Miss Marple thought it odd that a man so talkative before now appeared to choose each word with surgical care. And then there was Mr. Crow. His usual efficiency had given way to something more guarded. He avoided Lucy's gaze altogether and responded to Caroline with a touch too much deference. Something was wrong. Not in the will itself, perhaps, but in the way it had altered the unspoken balances of Magnolia Court. And Miss Marple had learned that where balance fails, truth often spills. As the cups were passed and conversation resumed in strained pockets, Miss Marple gently inquired whether Mr. Crow had received any correspondence from Eleanor prior to her passing. He looked momentarily perplexed, then shook his head. "Only standard instructions," he replied, waving away the matter as if it lacked substance. Miss Drake was increasingly eccentric in recent years. Miss Marple mentioned the letter. His response was swift and disinterested. Likely sentimental nonsense. Eleanor was prone to fanciful gestures. But Miss Marple had already withdrawn the envelope from her reticule, laying it softly on her lap. As Mr. Crow turned to address Caroline, she studied it anew. Her eyes were drawn not to the handwriting nor the blossom, already more brittle than before, but to the faintest of indentations at the corner of the page. 4 tiny pinpricks, as if something, once affixed, had been removed, something once present, and perhaps meant never to be seen. Later, alone in her room, Miss Marple laid the letter flat against her writing board. A magnifying lens confirmed what her instincts had already suspected. There had once been a second item enclosed. Not paper, not ink. A clipping, perhaps, or a photograph. Something deliberately excised. The pressed blossom remained, but its companion had been stolen away. Not by Eleanor. By someone who had intercepted the truth too soon. Or too late. Miss Marple folded the letter once more and placed it gently back in her case. The garden would soon bloom. But the story it would unveil had already begun to flower. It was the gardener's boy who found him, though the telling of it would vary by noon and be unrecognizable by dusk. At first it was said he had been taking in the morning air, then that he had slipped upon wet grass, later that he had been meeting someone in secret, though no one cared to say who. Oswald Fenley was discovered near the sundial at dawn, slumped as though in sleep. A shallow wound marked his temple, and there was mud upon his cuffs and knees. The doctor, summoned in haste but not alarm, declared it a fall, accidental perhaps after an evening tipple. "These old stones are treacherous," he said, and shook his head with a professional gravity that discouraged contradiction. But not all were satisfied. The household awoke to the news with a curious mix of surprise and something approaching resignation. Caroline said little, save to offer instructions for the constable's arrival. Lucy remained silent, pale as milk, and visibly shaken. Mr. Crow, who had left the house late the previous night, seemed less startled by the death than by the location of it. Miss Marple, though quietly seated with her knitting, noted all of this. She thought it telling that no one asked who might have seen Oswald last, or where he had gone after supper, or what business he might have had near the sundial, a place rarely visited by guests. And above all, she thought it most peculiar that a man whose pockets held no matchbook or coin had ventured into the orchard in his finest coat. People did not dress for misadventure. They dressed for meetings. Miss Marple took her morning walk with the same rhythm as always, measured, serene, and entirely purposeful. She arrived at the sundial well after the constable had gone, the ground cleared of onlookers but not of truth. She stood quietly for several minutes, her eyes taking in the pattern of flattened grass, the faint scuff on a stone edge, and the peculiar position of the sundial's gnomon, which someone had evidently twisted. A child's prank, perhaps, but a curious one considering no child had been near the orchard in days. She looked down, and it was there, almost unremarkable, beneath a curling leaf, the crushed remnant of a magnolia blossom, not fallen from the tree above, which bore only pink-tipped buds, but brought from elsewhere. The same kind of blossom that had arrived, pressed and withered in the strange letter. Miss Marple bent slowly and retrieved the petal with the gentleness of someone handling paper-thin evidence. She said nothing, not even to herself, but her thoughts assembled swiftly. Later she inquired of Edith Clamwell whether Mr. Fenley had worn his cravat at dinner. "A red silk one," the housekeeper confirmed, "with a pearl pin." Quite pleased with himself he was. Miss Marple merely nodded. The cravat had been found twisted round his collar, as if caught or pulled too tightly. The pearl pin had vanished. The constable had attributed the loosened knot to the fall. But Miss Marple had seen enough strangulations passed off as tumbles to recognize when a man had not fallen. He had been made to fall, and someone had ensured the story would match the earth beneath him. By the time the midday post arrived, word of Oswald Fenley's demise had already reached every cottage between Muchwood-on-Tyne and Little Midsley. It travelled not through telegram or paper, but along hedgerows and over garden gates, carried in the breathless tones of women exchanging recipes and regret. The news took on shape and color as it moved. He had died of shock. He had been poisoned. He had been struck by lightning. The sundial had cracked beneath him. Each retelling carried a moral. Drink less, speak kindly, marry wisely. But some versions bore sharper edges. It was said he had argued with Lucy after the will was read, that he had questioned the legitimacy of her inheritance, that he had raised his voice loud enough to be heard across the corridor, that he had threatened to visit the solicitor and contest it. "She's not who she thinks she is," someone had overheard, or claimed to. Miss Marple, seated once again beside Mrs. Hartley with her embroidery untouched, listened politely to these mutterings. She asked no questions but allowed others to fill the spaces. Gossip, she understood, was not a substitute for fact, but it was often a veil, transparent if held to the light. And when people gossiped so urgently, it was usually because something more dangerous than rumor was drifting beneath the surface, something someone hoped would not reach the roots of the matter, or the sundial, where truth waited in shadow. Constable Simmons arrived with the air of one who had hoped the day would pass without disturbance. A young man of narrow frame and moderate ambition, he wore his uniform with pride, though it sat slightly too large across the shoulders and too tight at the collar. He took statements with efficiency and tact, nodding solemnly, asking the right questions, and carefully not lingering too long on any that might lead beyond the path already chosen. To Miss Marple, his approach bore the familiar scent of conclusion reached before investigation. He accepted the doctor's view with respectful promptness. An accident, a stumble, nothing amiss. He wrote it all down in his pocketbook with the gravity of a man confirming a decision rather than making one. When Miss Marple asked, gently and without insistence, whether the cravat's unusual state had been noted, Constable Simmons replied that the doctor had seen nothing alarming. "Slipped during the fall," he said, and added somewhat defensively, "No signs of struggle. These things happen." It was not incompetence, Miss Marple decided. It was reluctance. The village did not want another scandal, not after the war, the shortages, the quiet tragedies no one had words for. They longed for peace, even if it meant smoothing the truth like creased linen. But peace at the cost of truth, Miss Marple knew, was a fragile peace indeed. And Magnolia Court was not done speaking, long after the constable had gone and the house had settled into that strained stillness. Particular to Morning Interrupted, Miss Marple returned to the orchard. She stood once again before the sundial, its face weathered and still, its gnomon casting a thin shadow across the engraved stone. She ran her fingers along the edge, lightly tracing the inscription, partially obscured now by moss and age. Veritas in umbra. Truth lies in shadow. A curious choice for a garden ornament, and not one Eleanor Drake would have selected on a whim. Latin, after all, was not fashionable amongst the villagers, and certainly not in garden statuary. The words lingered with Miss Marple as few did. Truth not in light, not in declaration or spectacle, but in shadow, where it must be sought, not shown. She turned and glanced back at the house, now quiet beneath its sloped roof. How many truths there had been kept in shade there. Old loves, hidden grievances, long-forgotten shame. And if this sundial had witnessed anything in 1943, as gossip now hinted, it had remained silent for decades. But truth, as she well knew, does not sleep forever. It merely waits for the right light to fall upon it. It was a small remark made by Edith Clamwell, too quickly brushed aside to be innocent, that led Miss Marple to the discovery. Over tea, Edith had muttered that Miss Drake's brooch, the garnet cluster with the silver clasp, had not been worn in some time. Put away for safekeeping, she assumed. But when Miss Marple asked discreetly where such items were usually kept, Edith replied without hesitation, "In the oak bureau, top drawer, under the letters." That bureau, now under Caroline's purview, had already been sorted, but Miss Marple's inquiry to Caroline received only a vague answer, that she had not found any such jewelry, and presumed it had been gifted or misplaced. Unlikely. A quiet word with the local pawnbroker, delivered not by Miss Marple herself, but via a former housemaid with reason to remember her kindness, confirmed that a gentleman matching Mr. Fenley's description had attempted to value a garnet brooch and pearl pin only a fortnight prior. The sale had not gone through. He had seemed disappointed, so Oswald had found the jewels, perhaps even taken them, and then he tried to convert them into leverage. Not for money, Miss Marple suspected, but for silence, and someone, it now seemed, had paid with far more than coin to keep the past buried. The village archives, tucked away in the rear wing of the parish office, were seldom disturbed. Dust lay thick upon the index folders, and the volunteer archivist seemed both startled and flattered by Miss Marple's request for access. With customary modesty, she explained that her interest was purely historical, which, of course, it was. It did not take long to find what she sought. Beneath a sheaf of parish notices and wartime bulletins, Miss Marple uncovered the engagement announcement, "Miss Eleanor Drake to Captain Lawrence Trent, Royal Engineers." The year was 1943. There were no wedding banns published, no follow-up announcement. And 2 months later, a separate entry, sparse, somber. Captain Trent presumed drowned, body recovered near Stonemore Weir. It was an odd phrasing. Presumed drowned, yet body recovered. The contradiction stood out. Official uncertainty often cloaked unofficial complications. And Eleanor had never been known to speak of the captain in the years that followed, not even once. Miss Marple noted, too, that the parish magazine had included no obituary for Captain Trent, nor any mention of a funeral at Magnolia Court. She closed the folder with care. There are silences that speak, and this one whispered of grief unacknowledged, and a bond buried with more than earth. Whatever had happened in 1943 had not simply ended an engagement. It had ended something far older, far deeper, and possibly far more dangerous. The past, once stirred, rarely returns quietly. Miss Marple's quiet inquiries, made over teacups and gentle pauses, began to yield their echoes. It was the vicar's wife who, with the delicacy of one unaccustomed to scandal, admitted that there had been talk, very soft, very speculative, that Captain Trent's affections had not been limited to Miss Drake. Rumor, she said, had once attached his name to a young housemaid then in service at Magnolia Court, one Edith Clamwell. "It may have been nothing, of course," she added quickly. "People said things during the war. Loneliness plays tricks." But the more Miss Marple listened, the more consistency she observed in these whispers. Edith had left the household abruptly around the time of Captain Trent's death and returned several years later as housekeeper, an unusual progression. And although Eleanor had never publicly commented, it was said she had taken to long walks alone in the orchard after the captain's funeral. There were, too, curious remarks about a quarrel on the day before his death, voiced anger, an argument overheard in the music room, and doors closed a little too firmly for a household as orderly as Magnolia Court. The war had many casualties, Miss Marple reflected. Not all of them fell on the battlefield. It was not through interrogation that Miss Marple coaxed the truth from Edith Clamwell, but through quiet presence, the kind that invites confession without demand. Edith had grown grey not just with age, but with the wear of long-held burdens. Her hands trembled as she folded linen, and her voice, when it came, had the tonality of memory rather than speech. "Yes," she said at last. "They were engaged, but Eleanor never truly forgave herself. Not after what happened." She paused, eyes distant. "She blamed herself, you see, for that night, for what she said, or what she didn't say. I don't know which." Miss Marple allowed the silence to grow, then asked softly whether Eleanor had ever spoken of the details. "Never plainly," Edith replied, "only that Lawrence had waited for someone by the sundial, and he never came back." There was a finality in her tone, yet something withheld, a reservation, the sort that guards not gossip, but truth. "She said it was her fault," Edith repeated, but there was more, much more. Things she couldn't say aloud. Miss Marple left her then, knowing that what had once been forbidden still clung to Edith's heart, not as fear but as loyalty. And loyalty, when twisted, could become a kind of silence that murders memory. It was Lucy who, hesitantly and with no small degree of confusion, presented the photograph to Miss Marple later that same day. She had found it, she explained, tucked into the pages of an old prayer book among her late father's belongings. The edges were worn, the paper faded, but the image was clear enough. 3 figures standing side by side in the garden of Magnolia Court. Eleanor Drake, Captain Lawrence Trent, and a woman Lucy identified only as her mother. There was nothing overt in their poses, no caption, no inscription. Yet something in the way the 3 stood, close yet unaligned, spoke of histories that had not run parallel. Lucy's eyes lingered on the image with unease. "She never spoke of this," she murmured. "Never of them." Miss Marple examined the photo closely. The resemblance between Lucy and the woman at the captain's side was striking, and the woman herself bore certain features not unlike Eleanor's own, a similarity too marked to be dismissed. 3 lives, 1 connection, and a possibility Miss Marple had begun to entertain in earnest, that Lucy was not merely the daughter of Oswald Fenley's late wife, but of someone entirely different, not by scandal necessarily, but by the silence that so often follows shame. It arrived without sound, no knock, no footfall. Simply a folded scrap of paper slid beneath Miss Marple's bedroom door in the early hours of morning. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink smudged. Ask what really happened by the sundial in 1943. There was no name, no signature, no flourish. Just the question, unspoken for decades, now whispered once more. Miss Marple held the note a long while before placing it beside the pressed magnolia in her case. 2 relics, 2 invitations to look where others had chosen not to. The sundial had become more than a garden ornament. It was a stage, a marker, a witness. It had seen the meeting that never came to pass, the grief that turned to silence, the truth that now stirred beneath the surface of inheritance, resentment, and long-dormant love. She folded the note carefully. Truth, she thought again, lies not in the light, but in the shadow it leaves behind. It was often said that gardeners remembered more than most, soil, like grief, having a way of preserving things beneath the surface. So it was with Mr. Rudge, Magnolia Court's former groundsman, now retired and tending a modest row of dahlias in the almshouse garden. Miss Marple, never one to underestimate the value of memory seasoned by silence, visited with a tin of barley biscuits, and a question she let settle slowly. 1943. He repeated, wiping his hands on his trousers. Yes, I remember. He spoke of the sundial, not its face, but what had happened there. There had been whispers at the time, though No one dared ask. He himself had seen Eleanor there the evening before the captain's body was found, dressed not in mourning but in blue, sitting quite still, as if waiting for something that never arrived. And there had been another thing, a figure moving along the orchard path, too distant to identify, yet purposeful. The next morning the orchard was silent, save for the sound of Edith Clamwell weeping. The police report had been brief, accidental drowning. But Mr. Rudge had seen the bruise on Captain Trent's temple when the body was brought through the gate. A cruel mark. Not the sort the river gives, he muttered. Miss Marple left the garden quietly, her hands folded beneath her shawl. Memories faded, yes, but they did not vanish, and when watered gently, as with dahlias, some returned in full bloom. The story had begun to take shape, not from confessions but from careful listening, and fragments preserved in the minds of those who had once looked away. Captain Lawrence Trent had been meant to meet someone by the sundial on the evening of his death, a rendezvous planned with care, and possibly desperation. He had, it seemed, wished to speak privately, perhaps to confess, perhaps to resolve something left unsaid. Eleanor had been seen walking the orchard paths that evening. Her silence in the years that followed, so often attributed to loss, now bore the unmistakable weight of guilt. She had waited by the sundial, or perhaps she had come to end something. What happened after remained unclear, but what was known was this: the captain never returned to his quarters. His body was found 2 days later, caught beneath a weir, with a bruise that did not match any current nor stone. The official verdict remained unchanged. But unofficially, emotionally, Miss Marple recognized the deeper truth. Eleanor had not merely lost someone she loved. She had failed to protect him, or worse, had chosen not to. The sundial had not told time that evening. It had marked a secret left to rot in shadow. Not everyone regarded the past with reverence. For some it was merely an untapped reservoir, ripe for exploitation. Miss Marple had begun to see with increasing clarity that Oswald Fenley, gregarious on the surface but calculating beneath, had stumbled upon something not intended for his eyes. Perhaps it had been a letter, tucked between estate ledgers, perhaps a photograph, or an old entry in a household account. But whatever he had found, it had connected Lucy, Eleanor, and the late Captain Trent in a way that unraveled the tidy narrative of inheritance. Oswald had not confronted the truth. He had attempted to trade on it. The visit to the pawnbroker, the disappearance of jewelry, the veiled remarks about legitimacy, all pointed to a man attempting to buy silence or leverage fear. What he had not accounted for was that the past he sought to manipulate was not his to control. He had threatened someone, not just with exposure, but with the collapse of a carefully preserved illusion. And someone, perhaps long exhausted by secrets, had taken action. Miss Marple had no proof yet, but she knew the scent of blackmail, and she knew it almost always ended, not with a bargain, but with a body. It was the piano bench that yielded it, worn, creaking, and long dismissed as a place for old sheet music and tuning keys. Yet beneath a velvet folio of Beethoven sonatas lay a thin volume, leather-bound and fastened with an antique clasp. Miss Marple opened it with reverent hands. The handwriting was Eleanor's, precise, elegant, and slightly faded with time. The entries began shortly after Captain Trent's death and extended into the first few years of her withdrawal from society. They spoke not of romance, but of regret, of decisions made too hastily, of a meeting missed or mistimed, of a man she had once loved deeply, and of a child, unacknowledged in public, but clearly referenced with guarded tenderness. One passage stood out. I could never say it. Not then. Not now. But she deserved more than silence. And perhaps that is why I cannot let go. The sundial remembers what I cannot speak. The journal painted no direct picture, but between its lines Miss Marple read a life haunted by omission, not commission. A life shaped by the inability to reconcile love, shame, and family pride. And yet, it was not what Eleanor had written that chilled her most. It was what was no longer there. The final leaf had been torn. The spine showed it clearly. A jagged thread where a page had once been, now violently removed. Not clipped, not fallen loose. Taken. The last full entry ended mid-thought. He said he would wait by the sundial. I told him. And then, nothing. Miss Marple stared at the space as one might stare at an open grave, aware of what should be present, and painfully conscious of its absence. Who had taken it? And when? Had Eleanor torn it herself in a final act of discretion? Or had someone else, fearing what it contained, removed the truth by hand? Whatever was written there had mattered, perhaps enough to protect a name, perhaps enough to justify a death. Miss Marple closed the book softly. One page lost, one secret still breathing. But truth had a way of pressing itself into even the smallest silences. And someone, she now suspected, had killed not once, but twice. There are silences that occur before storms, and silences that follow them. But the silence that settled over the drawing room at Magnolia Court on that pale afternoon was of a third kind, heavy, watchful, and composed of waiting hearts rather than weather. Miss Marple, seated without command, yet commanding all attention, had gathered the household with the gentlest of insistence. She had asked for a quiet hour, nothing more, and for once no one had dared refuse. Caroline sat nearest the hearth, composed but pale, her posture one of practiced dignity. Mr. Crow stood behind the escritoire, hands clasped behind his back, his brow drawn in what might have been concern, or merely legal habit. Lucy, though evidently confused, obeyed without protest, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Edith Clamwell stood near the door, her eyes lowered. Mrs. Hartley had settled beside the tea tray, though she had poured no cups. Miss Marple began without preamble. "There are truths," she said gently, "that do not come to light until the right season. Magnolia Court, I believe, has waited rather a long time for spring." The room did not stir, but its tension deepened. 2 deaths, one mourned with difficulty, and behind them both, shadows of the past. She paused and produced the letter, the pressed blossom still preserved. "This was sent to Miss Drake just before her death. It speaks not of fear, but of unfinished duty. I believe she knew what was coming, and I believe she made peace with it." Caroline stiffened almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple continued. The will was her final gesture, an attempt to right a wrong that had festered too long. Still no one spoke, but several looked, suddenly and almost involuntarily, towards Lucy. Miss Marple folded the letter once more, and placed it gently on the table. The truth, she knew, would bruise before it healed, but it could no longer be kept from blooming. "The will," Miss Marple said softly, "was no accident of sentiment, nor was it a whim of age or eccentricity." She turned her gaze briefly to Mr. Crow. "You were surprised, I believe, by the changes Eleanor made in those final weeks." He nodded once, the movement clipped and uneasy. Miss Marple continued. "Miss Drake was many things, proud, private, and fiercely protective of her family's dignity. But she was not cruel. If she altered her will, if she granted Lucy a portion of her personal fortune, It was not pity that moved her. She let that sentence linger. In the course of recent days, I have come across a journal, hidden, not misplaced. It reveals a sorrow, long held in silence, a rendezvous missed, a man lost, and a child never spoken of publicly. She glanced at Lucy then, whose face had become utterly still. Eleanor was not Lucy's mother, but she was her aunt, older sister to the woman Lucy knew only briefly. That sister had loved Captain Trent, and Lucy is the child of that love. A faint gasp stirred the room. It came, not unexpectedly, from Caroline. Miss Marple pressed on, calm and unwavering. Miss Drake supported Lucy quietly, through distance and silence. She could not undo the past, but she could acknowledge it, financially at least, and that is what she did with her will. She turned back to the others. Oswald Fenley discovered the truth, perhaps from Eleanor's letters or the diary. He saw in it an opportunity to discredit the will, to cast doubt on Lucy's claim, perhaps even to press for a larger portion. Her eyes narrowed, not with malice, but with quiet conviction. He attempted to leverage the past, and someone who feared what that leverage would cost, acted swiftly. No one spoke, but in that breathless silence, a boundary had been crossed. The matter was no longer one of inheritance. It had become a question of identity, and what someone might do to protect it. Lucy's breath caught, but she did not speak. Her gaze had lowered, not in shame, but as if reaching for a memory long left untouched. Miss Marple's voice, still gentle, carried the weight of things no longer avoidable. There are photographs, she said, letters, and most telling of all, a striking resemblance, one that cannot be ignored. Your mother, Lucy, was not Eleanor Drake, nor the wife Oswald Fenley named in passing. She was Eleanor's sister, a woman who, during the war, fell in love with a man promised to another, Captain Lawrence Trent. Miss Marple did not linger on judgment. She was not interested in scandal, only in truth. When the child was born, she was given to Oswald and his wife to raise. The marriage, such as it was, did not last. Lucy remained. But Eleanor never stopped watching, never stopped providing. Mr. Crow's expression had hardened slightly, as though the legal implications were beginning to take root. Miss Marple turned once more to Caroline. You must have known, or suspected, the entries torn from the diary. The missing page spoke of the sundial, of Eleanor's final guilt. Caroline remained frozen, her lips parted but no words forming. Miss Marple said quietly, It was not hatred that killed Oswald. It was fear. Fear that the past, once unearthed, would alter everything you believed yourself to be. Heir, protector, daughter of respectability. A silence fell. Then Lucy looked up, her voice thin but steady. She gave me more than money, she said, her words trembling. She gave me a name. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Eleanor had tried at the end to lay down her burden, and now, it seemed, the burden had passed, not into silence, but into truth. It was not greed alone that drove Oswald Fenley. Miss Marple had long understood that greed by itself was blunt and often ineffectual. It was fear, the fear of irrelevance, of being found out, of losing status, that turned greed into action. Oswald, having unearthed the truth of Lucy's parentage, saw in it an opportunity cloaked in righteousness. He, a man of dwindling finances and thinning reputation, had stumbled upon a revelation capable of fracturing the family's inheritance. If Lucy's claim could be questioned, her legitimacy cast in doubt, then Caroline, and by association he himself, might press to reclaim what was properly theirs. He approached Eleanor, not as a protector of family honor, but as a man offering an unspoken exchange, silence for revision, a quiet undoing of her final act of conscience. But Eleanor did not yield, and when he turned his intentions elsewhere, perhaps to Caroline, perhaps with threats not of exposure but of public disgrace, his gamble failed. Miss Marple looked toward Caroline then, her voice calm, her eyes unblinking. "You could not bear the weight of another scandal, could you? First the war, then the whispers. Magnolia Court had already endured too many shadows." Caroline said nothing, but her eyes, sharp and dry, no longer protested. Oswald had not died in anger. He had died because he knew too much, and someone somewhere between inheritance and identity had decided that silence was not only safer, it was necessary. Caroline's confession, when it came, was not dramatic. There were no tears, no trembling hands, only a soft, strained stillness that spread through her body like an aging root at last giving way beneath the weight of its tree. Miss Marple had suspected from the beginning that Eleanor's death had not been entirely natural. She had observed the hesitation in Edith's speech, the faint bitterness in Caroline's tone when the will was first read, and above all, the maid's testimony of hearing someone weeping in a room already declared lifeless. "She drank it willingly," Caroline said at last. "She wanted peace. I merely helped it along." The words were not cruel, nor defensive. They were worn down, like stones turned over too many times. Miss Marple did not judge her. She understood, though she did not condone. Eleanor had perhaps known. The tea had been prepared by familiar hands. The hour had been quiet, and for a woman long burdened by silence, it had likely felt like mercy. But Oswald's death, that was different. "He threatened everything," Caroline continued, her voice thin. "Not just the will, the family name, the house, everything Eleanor tried to protect." So she met him in the orchard. Whether he laughed or sneered or pleaded, she did not say, only that he fell quickly. And when the sundial's shadow touched the pressed magnolia in his coat pocket, she knew it was over. Not justice, not truly, but preservation. And preservation, she believed, was duty. Miss Marple rose quietly and retrieved the letter from the small table beside her. The envelope was worn now, its edges softened by handling, but the pressed blossom within still held its form, fragile, pale, and impossibly persistent. "A magnolia," she said softly, "is not a flower given lightly. It does not boast. It endures." She placed the letter gently beside the teacup, now empty, now harmless. "This," she continued, "was Miss Drake's final confession, not written in words but in symbol. A magnolia, preserved and folded into a page, a message to herself and to the one who would understand it." No one interrupted. Even Mr. Crow, whose instinct was always to categorize and contain, remained silent. Miss Marple looked at Lucy, whose eyes brimmed with something unspoken. Not grief, not relief, but the aching sensation of truth, at last allowed to breathe. "She left this not to shame anyone, nor to expose," Miss Marple said. "She left it as a sign that she had remembered, that she had loved, that she had, in her way, made peace." The house, long braced against revelation, seemed at last to loosen its grip. In silence, the magnolia rested on the table, small, pressed, and perfect. The final bloom of a garden long tended in shadow. The morning after the final gathering brought a stillness not born of suspense, but of resolution. The garden, so long a place of whispered meetings and buried memory, had taken on a new rhythm. The magnolias, heavy with bloom, moved softly in the breeze, their pale petals catching sunlight like pages finally turned. Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravel path beside Mrs. Hartley. neither woman speaking for some time. There was comfort in the silence, companionable, not cautious, the kind that follows when much has been said and little need be added. Mrs. Hartley murmured something about the weather, how early spring had arrived this year, how the frosts had spared the roses. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts not on weather but on time. Time as it settles over houses like Magnolia Court, time as it preserves things no one intended to remember. "The house feels different," Mrs. Hartley said at last. "Lighter." Miss Marple looked ahead toward the orchard and the sundial, now clean of moss, its Latin inscription more visible than it had been in years. "Yes," she replied, "lighter, and perhaps less afraid." They paused beside the low stone wall, where a small cluster of magnolia blossoms had dropped, unbruised. Spring had indeed arrived. But more than that, Magnolia Court had finally begun to exhale. There are houses in which sorrow lingers, not as sound or scent, but as weight. Magnolia Court had long borne such a burden. Grief turned to silence, silence into habit, and habit into heritage. Now, for the first time in years, the atmosphere had changed. Doors opened with less resistance. The great stairwell, once shadowed by unspoken things, seemed brighter, though no one had altered the curtains. Even Edith Clamwell's tread carried less heaviness as she moved through her duties with quiet steadiness. The house had not forgotten what had happened within its walls. Eleanor's withdrawal, Caroline's choices, the long-kept secrets embedded in its very bricks. But it had, in some ineffable way, accepted them. Truth, once spoken, has a curious effect. It does not erase sorrow, nor does it undo the damage, but it allows breath to return where breath had been held too long. Miss Marple understood this well. The dead had been heard, the living had spoken, and somewhere between the two, Magnolia Court had found something like peace. Not absolution, but clarity. And in old houses, clarity is a rare and precious gift. Lucy had not spoken of inheritance since the reading of the will. She had not demanded her share, nor questioned its terms. And yet, once truth had emerged, truth written in faded photographs and Eleanor's trembling script, something had shifted within her. She spent her mornings walking the upper corridors, pausing before old portraits, rooms once locked, now gently opened. She asked few questions but listened closely when Edith spoke of Eleanor's childhood, or when Mrs. Hartley reminisced about summer fêtes in the orchard. When the solicitor wrote to confirm her standing, she replied with gratitude, but also with instruction. Part of the house, she said, must serve a new purpose. A portion of the east wing, unused for years, would be opened as a small school for village girls. Not grand, not ostentatious, but quietly alive with books, with laughter, with futures unburdened by secrets. Miss Marple, informed of this with a gentle nod over tea, had merely smiled. Lucy had not sought restoration through wealth, but through meaning. In that choice lay not just grace, but strength. For inheritance, Miss Marple believed, is not merely what one receives, it is what one chooses to make of it. Caroline remained at Magnolia Court while arrangements were made. There was no flight, no legal obstruction, no great scandal, only a woman quietly sorting through letters and clothing, preparing for what she called an absence. She had not asked for pity, nor had she sought forgiveness, but what she received from those who mattered was dignity. Miss Marple visited her one final time before departure. Caroline offered her tea, poured with the same steady hand that had, months ago, disguised poison. And yet, there was no pretense now, only a tired honesty, worn not with pride but with acceptance. "There are things," Miss Marple said gently, that cannot be undone?" Caroline had nodded. "And some," she replied, "that should not be repeated. The past would not change, but the weight of it, once carried alone, had now been shared, and in the sharing the burden had softened, if only a little. Miss Marple saw not a villain, but a woman imprisoned by fear and duty, driven by a loyalty that, however misplaced, had been terribly human. Justice had been served in its quiet English way, but so had understanding, and that, Miss Marple knew, was the beginning of healing. That afternoon Miss Marple returned to her needlework, her tea cooling beside her on a tray of polished oak. The house was still, not with silence, but with rest. She thought of the Magnolia, of its resilience, its fragility, of the secrets it had witnessed and the truths it had finally coaxed from stone. People, she reflected, were not so different. They too buried things, memories, mistakes, unspoken affections. But like gardens, they responded to time, to warmth, to light. The smallest clues, a letter folded wrongly, a cry heard too late, a flower pressed between pages, could reveal the deepest roots of human nature. It was never grand gestures that solved things. It was noticing what others did not, and allowing what had long been buried to finally grow. Miss Marple sipped her tea and set down her needle. The garden would bloom again, and this time, nothing need be hidden beneath it. And so, with spring blooming once more at Magnolia Court, the truth has finally stepped out from the shadows. In the end, it wasn't just a matter of murder or inheritance. It was about guilt, silence, and the quiet courage it takes to let the past speak at last. Miss Marple, in her ever-gentle way, didn't uncover the mystery by force, but by listening to the smallest things, a misplaced petal, a torn page, a silence that rang louder than words. Eleanor Drake's final act was not one of wealth, but of redemption, and for Lucy, the truth wasn't a burden. It was the beginning of belonging. As for Caroline, perhaps she wasn't a villain after all, but a woman afraid to lose the only version of her world she'd ever known. But what about you? If you were in Caroline's shoes, would you have done the same to protect your family's name? Or would you have let the past rise, whatever the cost? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts, your theories, and your take on what really matters in a mystery. And don't forget, your comments help others discover our stories too. So thank you for being part of this growing circle. If you enjoyed this mystery, we'd be absolutely delighted if you'd subscribe for more Miss Marple-style tales, and share this story with fellow lovers of classic whodunits, friends, family, anyone who enjoys a good cup of tea, and an even better puzzle. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your mind sharp, and remember, even the gentlest garden can hide the deepest roots. Best.